aggression. I had not
Oh, where
heard.
you're from, and I've heard.
Well, no, I said it amuses me. I didn't say.
I didn't hear that until I moved to the Ozarks. No, I heard it. If you are from which part of the country do you follow the war? Some people think so, some
He
people
also
think no.
locked up habeas corpus at
Okay,
the same
there we
time,
go.
so.
Yeah, so we have different ideas on, thank you, Josh, on who Abraham Lincoln was. I bought Jay got a book, one of the I Survived books about the Civil War, and that's why we're going to Gettysburg, because he was so excited about Gettysburg. Well, someone from church gave me a Civil War children's book to read with him, and it was written by a Southern sympathizer.
Oh, no.
And so Jay was like, I have questions. And I said, oh, yes, no, but I understand that's sort of where they are in their head. So we had a very interesting conversation. And my favorite is, what do you think of Savannah, Georgia?
Good place, somebody called.
It's a beautiful place. Why is it so beautiful?
Charming.
And charming?
Because Grant didn't get at it.
Because they surrendered, right? So Savannah said, we give up. Please don't destroy our city. Do not come at me if you are from Savannah. That's where John Wesley actually went and lived for a while. And there's a great statue of him on the square where I figured out he is as tall as I am.
Oh.
He was really a big guy. And I'm 5'1.5". And I just was so struck by how beautiful the city was.
Yeah.
And then my brother's like, well, yeah, it didn't get destroyed because so the other capitals in the South, they don't really love to hear about how beautiful Savannah is, right? Because there's an act of, did you save your city? Did you surrender before you should have? There's some feelings, right? And it's going to depend on where you were raised. And that's what you have to hold in your head to understand the difference between the E source and the J source. So in the E source, which is called the Elohist, the text calls God Elohim, which means God, or sometimes thought to be the plural gods. We've talked about monolatry and how that can kind of get in the way. It says God's personal name, Yahweh, was introduced to Moses in Exodus 3:9-14. So it names God like the P source. It names God like the P source. The symbol E is for Elohist, but it is often tied to Ephraim, which is a city, an area of the north. So remember, we said J stands for Yahwist, but is tied to Judah. Judah's in the south. You can tie E to Ephraim, which is up in the north, and that will help you. I mean, not that you are walking around with a map of it in your head. I'm not. But it helps kind of remember north and south because Judah is the south. E predominantly features northern places and people, just like an account of the Civil War written from a northern perspective would talk about the battles up north where we protected our stuff, right? And the stories in the south would probably be more in the south. You just get a different perspective. Judah is not writing about what's happening in Dan. Remember, I did the sermon about Dan. Some of you were there, and Dan was way, way, way up north, and it's where they set up, when the kingdom split, they set up what they call a cultic center. They set up a place where people could worship instead of having to go south to Judah. And so you end up getting this, like, they're going to talk about Shechem, they're going to talk about Dan, they're going to talk about Bethel and Shiloh. Those are the big, important places in the north. All the stories aren't going to be about Jerusalem. They don't want to talk about Jerusalem. They're Yankees, basically. Okay. Jacob gives Ephraim his blessing in the story. And E sometimes provides rationalizations for strange behavior of characters. So E is really quick to say, but they didn't sleep together in the same room until they were married. E is really quick to say that. E is really quick to say, I know this looks bad, but actually, there's some moralizing, some smoothing over of the kinks, so to speak. Whereas Jay's more like, this bad thing happened. And E's like, but it's not what it looks like. So you can, they're a little like more prudish. It's the Sunday school version of the stories are more likely to come from E because it's a cleaner, like nicer version of the story, a little bit more of a moral tale. God's purpose was bigger than political structure. So Jay has Jerusalem, they have the king, they have the power. They're going to write about how God works through the structure they have. And E's like, don't pay attention to that. God's outside all of that. God's above all of that. So let's not talk about politics stuff. So it's not just like a left or right kind of thing. It's much more a north or south kind of thing, where how important, how entrenched do you think your world's structure is tied to God? Well, it depends on whether it's your structure or the other people's structure. Does that make sense? And then it does not appear in the prehistory. So there's nothing in Genesis 1-11. And God is not anthropomorphic. Remember, J is God walking in the garden, talking in the garden, being in the garden. P is God is a voice far, far away. E is I'm giving you dreams and visions and angels. So it's different. Now, we did have a J story that had a vision last week when we did the covenant. We had Abraham went to sleep, right? And he saw the thing. And God uses angels and dreams to show people what to do, except in E, God wrote the 10 Commandments. Like God had a finger or something, right? Or a hand and a chisel. Okay. A really fortuitous earthquake. Yes, I don't know. So that's E. You don't see God walking around in these stories. And in the E source, Moses did not receive the law on Sinai. He received it on Mount Horeb, which is where the Samaritans worshipped and thought that happened. Remember, we're in the north. Joshua is a hero of the north. And Aaron is treated unkindly. Boy, the E source does not like Aaron. Now, if you remember back to our first week, we talked about the importance of Noah making that sacrifice on the ark. If Noah's making a sacrifice, we knew it wasn't the priestly source, because the priestly source would be the first one to say, only priests can make sacrifices. Jay would be like, and they made sacrifices. They got all their authority from Aaron. Aaron made the first sacrifice, and all the authority derives from there, right? And E is like, Aaron made a lot of mistakes and did dumb things and really maybe shouldn't be this hero. I know it's all kind of interconnected, but when we talked about Dan, that city up in the north, in a sermon recently, we talked about Dan and how what the king in the north did was he said, you can't keep going down to Jerusalem to do all your holy stuff. So I'm going to set up some priests of my own in this new place, and we're going to build some golden calves, right? And the people can come and they can worship. Guess who those priests aren't related to? Aaron. And so Jerusalem priests looked at them and went, that's not how that works. E didn't want Aaron's authority. They didn't think they were northern. They didn't need Aaron's authority because Aaron had that, like, Jerusalem, the priests were in Jerusalem. The priests are of Aaron's line. That's where this weird Aaron thing comes out. But you're going to find stories that just aren't that great about Aaron. And then you're going to go, I smell someone from the north. It's a weird connection, but it's the connection over, it's the same as the political thing. Everything was in Jerusalem. The political power was in Jerusalem. The worship space was in Jerusalem. And so he's going to eschew the political stuff, and it's going to eschew all the temple stuff because we need to be able to have our own thing.
So Aaron brought the golden calf with him, essentially.
I think E doesn't even tell the story of the golden calf. And I can't remember why, but there's some weird thing where, like, they wouldn't even tell that story. Because I immediately went to, they must have told the golden calf because Aaron is kind of a fool in that. But I think that's a J story. I think that's a J story. And that may be why, if they had the E source at the time they split and went north and they built the golden calf, it might not have felt so awful if it wasn't in the stories that E told. Or maybe they took it out because it would contradict what they were doing. It's a weird situation. Okay, so here is the source comparison for these in, oh, you can't see the headings. It's like black on black. So this is the J source, this is the P source, and this is the E source. So God is called Lord. In P source, God is called God for a while. And then in the E source, God is usually called Elohim, except in the story of Moses. God shows up in person in J, by voice only in P, and in angels and dreams in E. God is immanent and involved in both J and E. Just, is God standing here or is God sending you a dream? And in the P source, God is transcendent and powerful and less intimately involved. In the concerns of J, you get this big epic story, but in the E source, it's the epic story of the North. And it's maybe slightly less epic. It's more like morale, a little bit more morality tale. And of course, the priests, they don't care about your story. They care about genealogy. They care about the priests. They care about the order of things and the ritual. And in the J source, people are flawed. They try and fail. Whereas in the E source, they appear flawed, but they're better than you think. Okay? P is, they don't care. People are not as important as their genealogy. Just tell me who their people are. And then timing, usually this one is dated early, before 722 BCE, so the fall of the North. And then early, but after J. So the main thought is that J was written down, and then the North was like, we also have different versions of the stories, so we're going to write that down. Yes?
You may have already covered this, but on each of these sources, what is the thinking? Was it one person or multiple people?
No idea. No idea. Not a lot of people writing, right? So it was a big effort, and likely by someone very educated. And then the thought is they took JE, what we call JE, the combination of the two, or one and the other, into the exile with them. Which is important, right? Because we think the North was basically dismantled by the Assyrians. And so if those stories are going into Babylon, they're going with the Judeans. They're going with the J folks. But it also tells us something interesting because they thought it was important to take it with them. That's interesting, right? If you're the people of the South, you're taking the Northern stories with you because that's your whole family. It's kind of beautiful, I think. Or there was more mixing around of them than we might assume. And then they take J and E into exile, where the priests go, we have some time on our hands. I feel like we ought to write down the proper way of doing things before we lose our identity.
Exile, Babylonia, not Egypt.
Right, they're in Babylon. So there are some issues for understand the patriarch and matriarch narratives. And this morning I touched on one of them in my sermon, which was David was not just David. In today's scripture story, David was a representative of his people. And Goliath was a representative of his people, right? David is small and frail and young and underdeveloped compared to Goliath, who's overdeveloped and strong and great armor. It's one people versus the other people. So sometimes the stories, if you step back from them, you might wonder if the person it's really a story about Jason, or is it a story about Jason's people? Is it a story about David, or is David his own people and it's an allegory? You can read it both ways. That was very, very common in the Middle Ages. And biblical interpretation was to read that as an allegory for their people. But it's because some of the stories make a little bit better sense if you read it as, this is a story of peoples and not me and you. My people and your people. So there's a little bit of that might catch you. And then there are these things called narrative cycles. You know, not all of our storytelling is linear. And so the wheel just keeps turning sometimes, and you get the same story. She's not my wife. She's my sister. She's not my wife. She's my sister. New generation. She's not my wife. She's my sister, right? It's a cycle. You keep getting the same stories. Those aren't from three separate sources. It's one of them gives you two versions of the story. So there are cycles. And then there's an argument form, a structure concern that is a little tricky. I'm sorry, I thought your buddy was going to be here tonight. So when you read the patriarch and matriarch narratives, you will find really interesting stuff that we don't preach because, but you will also find a lot of repetition. Now, repetition is something that was very important in Jewish writing. And when you look at the Psalms, have you ever noticed how repetitive the Psalms are? One line, and then the next line is almost... I should have found one in advance. They will perish, but thou dost endure. They will all wear out like a garment. Thou changest them like raiment, and they pass away, but thou art the same. Thy years have no end. The Psalms never say something once. The Psalms say it, and then they say it another way. Say it another way. Say it, and say it another way. That is Hebrew poetry structure. So that is going to come up in their storytelling too. You're going to have things that are together, that are repetitive because they're being poetic. They're being creative. The other thing is you're going to have different sources, right? What a challenge. I've got the story from the north and the story from the south. And if it isn't focused on a southern or a northern place, if it's a story about Moses, how are we going to preserve both of these stories? Are we just going to say, they weren't going to say header, the north, and then the story, header, the south, and then the story, right? They're not going to do that. They're seeing themselves as one people, and they've got these two stories. They've got different sources. They've got the narrative cycles. They've got a different argument structure. So we're going to go a little bit through that so you can understand that. And to do that, I have a story from college. So I had this professor named Paul Parker. He was the professor of my heart, meaning he taught me how to learn and how to think and how to make arguments. He was he's still alive. Hi, Paul. He is a specialist in the Supreme Court. And so I took a constitutional law class with him in my sophomore year. It was too early to take it, but I loved it. And all we did was read Supreme Court decisions and talk about them in class 3 hours one night a week from 7 to 10 p.m. And I had all these upperclassmen, and I was very intimidated. And, you know, you read and you read and you read and you read, but you can understand them more over time. But court decisions have a very particular form. So I was in this class and they set up a moot court. And if you were one of the lawyers, you had to make an argument in front of the court. And you could be a justice or you could do a friendly brief in it. So I opted to be a justice because I was not going to stand up in front of all those juniors and seniors and make an argument. But he kept telling us, if you're going to write this, don't write me a paper. Write a legal argument. Write a Supreme Court decision. Don't write a paper. You've been reading decisions all year. You can write one. So I would go into the library, and back then we had 2 computers that were connected to LexisNexis. Do you remember? And you could do legal research. There were 2 computers you could do it on. And one of my classmates was holding those computers down. Every time I went into the library, I would go at 9 o'clock at night and they'd be there. I'd go at 7 o'clock in the morning and they'd be there. And this went on for a couple of weeks. And I was so annoyed. I think I got to them for 10 or 15 minutes. One time I got a couple things to look up. It was very frustrating. So one day, about 3 days before my paper was due, we'd heard the arguments. I went to the constitutional law section of the library because I know my system, Charlotte. I'm looking at Charlotte. She's a librarian. And I just walked in the aisles up at Truman State, just hoping there was some book where I might get some of this information because I had to cite cases. And tucked between 2 volumes, it was on this side, right here, there was a little, almost magazine, little book, but magazine thickness. And I pulled it out and it was called How to Write a Supreme Court Decision. And it was written by a justice. So I took it home and I read it. And then I sat down and I wrote the most Supreme Court sounding college paper ever. And I got a wonderful grade. And then he wrote on the bottom, could have cited some actual cases. And so I had to explain to him, I couldn't get in to find the cases. And so he worked for better access for us. Sometimes things are in a really distinctive argument form that we have to learn so we can write it, right? We all sit in high school and they show us this is a business letter. This is a personal letter. Right now they have to teach us this is a business email, I'm assuming. This is a personal email. But you have to learn how to do the form properly or it doesn't count. And that's what this professor taught me. So when you were in high school speech class or college speech class, you probably learned this argument structure, right? This is how you make an argument. My son has to write paragraphs all summer that do this because they want him to write a proper argument. Well, this is one structure for a paragraph. It's one structure for a speech. You say what you're going to say. You give support point 1, support point 2, support point 3, and then you say what you said. I have never written a sermon on that structure, ever. There is nothing in the Bible written with this argument structure, except the preface at the front of each chapter. Because this is our Western 20th and 21st century argument structure. This is not how the Bible writes an argument. Ancient Israel's speech class taught them the format that we call Madam, I'm Adam, which is a palindrome. I'm going to say something about flies. And then I'm going to say something about curtains. Then I'm going to say something about dogs. And then I'm going to tell you what I really want to tell you. Now I'm going to tell you a story about dogs that reflects this thing. And then I'm going to tell you a story about curtains that reflects this thing. And then I'm going to tell you a story about flies that reflects that knowledge. And if you hear that, you will go, I do not know why I am reading for 3 days in my Bible. And I got 2 stories about flies, 2 stories about curtains, and 2 stories about dogs. Whereas an ancient reader would have said, ooh, what's in the middle? As soon as they got to the story about dogs, they would go, oh, we've got a repeat. Let me back up, because that's the point. That's the point. And then these stories are going to have a slightly different perspective because we know the thing. So this is the argument structure you see not constantly it's not every sentence is in a chiasm, but there are chiasms all over the Bible. There are chiasms within chiasms. So this is the structure, some in the New Testament, some in the Old Testament. And so when you hear a repeat, your ears need to perk up. Wait a minute. Was the last story I read also like a story I read a few minutes ago? And you can find the chiasm and the central point. So this is my preaching method. This is the simplest form. Generally, I tell you a story about my life. Then I tell you a story about scripture. Then I tell you what I want to make you go, aha. And then I apply it to scripture, and then I apply it to life, and whoop, we're done. That is a simplified biblical argument structure. And I think it works because, that's why I choose to use it, because it makes sense to me. But I have had very linear thinkers, like high school science teachers, people who do data entry, tell me that they find my sermons incomprehensible. Because you go from one thing to another, and here's how you write a speech, Kim. You tell us what you're going to say, then supporting point 1, every pastor in town is doing that. Right? That's fine. It's fine. I like to do this one. So you'll start to see it sometimes if you're thinking about it.
We'll be looking for it every time.
Oh yeah. You can. Amanda will sometimes come up and go, here's your chiasm today. And she's got all the points because she knows. But like today wasn't a perfect chiasm, but we started with the Philistines. And we talked about how the Philistines we got it to the point where the Philistines are unknown. We don't know what to do with them. They're a challenge. We ended talking about what are your challenges, who are your Philistines, what's your Goliath, right? Then we talked about, at one point, the story of the therapist. And then the turning point in there was, of course, David saying the battle is the Lord's. That's the point. That's the take home. And then you back all the way out of those stories with the same thing. So I'm training you to read the Bible every Sunday. That's what I tell myself. Because if you get through chiastic structure and you start to understand the structure and it makes sense to your brain, then when you open the Bible and you see the structure, it's going to make slightly more sense to your brain. It's also, if you've watched The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or you've read Douglas Adams' books, it is also called the Douglas Adams method of preaching, because he starts here and he ends here, and then the whole thing is a chiasm. Chiasm, half of an X. That's half of an X. So that's the structure works in preaching because it's like a gentle way to bring people to new conclusions. Because you're listening to the story, you're hearing the story, then the evidence is, of course, the difference in the story after the point, and then you're more open to, it's like a transformational preaching method. The structure works in the Bible because northern story, southern story, northern story, southern story, northern story, southern story, point. And so we can incorporate these dual things to get across. We may not know what the point is. So if you will open your notebooks, if you have them, to the reference section, let's look again. And I don't have this slide for those online. I'm sorry, I don't have it in this week. Let's look at reference G on page 62. Remember, this is the structure of Noah's Ark. This is a half an X. This is masterful chiastic structure. I spent years of my life putting this northern, not northern and southern, but the J version and the P version together so that they make sense, because we pulled it apart and it became obvious how twitchy those stories are if you try to read them side by side. But we've been reading them our whole lives and not realizing probably how many little stumble places there are, because it's so masterfully put together. So this is my favorite chias of the Bible. Now, you might get stories that aren't as clear. You might get like a story of an assault, and then the next story is about a city on the plain, and then there's a point about who you can trust and who you can't trust. And then you go back to a story about a city on a plain, and then you go back to a story about an assault. It's not that those stories aren't important. It's that the masterful people were able to put them together so that they heard a point. We miss the point all the time because we're looking for an introduction or a conclusion. And we are paying more attention to the top and bottom of the argument, and they buried the lead. Intentionally buried the lead. So an early reader would have gone, ah. Now, when I do the sermons, I don't always say, and here's my point, right? I say something and then I start backing through the stories, but now that point's in it and you have the time to get it slowly. They're more like, here's the point. And it may seem completely unrelated. Bye, Sam. Bye, Josh. Thanks. But that's how they incorporated these stories, these different voices, and it just is a different argument. It just is a different argument style. And so if you know that, it's kind of like a Supreme Court decision. You don't pick up a Supreme Court decision and read it like you do Cosmo magazine. Nope. You don't read it like you read an academic paper. It's a whole different ball of wax. And if you don't know what you're reading, then and how the argument is structured, it's harder to read it. Sometimes people will say to me that the Bible is like one book, but it's actually more like a library. I think of it as kind of Barnes and Noble. You walk into Barnes and Noble, and if you want a recipe, you don't go to the self-help section. You know where the recipes are. And if you want poetry, you don't go to the sci-fi fiction. You go to the poetry. But we don't always teach people how to find what they're looking for or what the type of literature, what the type of argument is going to be. And so it's hard for people to read. And then we expect people to bring their conclusions. It's not always super fair. So you've had the example of Noah's Ark. There's an artistic rendering of that. I might have found that before AI. I was so tempted today because I talked about things we were afraid of, and I was so tempted to mention AI and then make some of you into like AI memes so that you also would be afraid, because we do that in the office. Turn Stella into a human. Turn Susan Newcomb into a dog. We did that too. Guess what kind of dog she was? No, Susan Newcomb.
Oh, bulldog.
Golden Retriever. Oh yeah, she just looks so friendly. We may have to clip that out of the video. I shouldn't have that. Shuffled with purpose. So many stories in the Genesis and elsewhere in the Bible have chiastic structure. That's both Old and New Testament. Charlotte brought up that she went home and opened her Bible, and there's like a big long preface at the beginning. And then as you go through, sometimes it'll say like Genesis, and there'll be 3 pages of the world's tiniest print. That is going to be talking about JEDP. It's going to be talking about the timing. It's going to be talking about structure. Those are, if you have a Bible that is edited by Bible scholars, it's going to have these prefaces that have all this information that's in teeny, teeny, tiny print. And when you read some of those, they'll say, here's the structure. There's a chiast here. There's a chiast here. And they will name them and show them in that arrow configuration, like I did my slides. So I'm not telling you something I came up with. Like, I'm not that smart. It is something that Bible scholars have brought up. It's the first thing Paul and I connected on when I came here. I preached about chiasm, and he came up and talked to me, and I said, let's be friends forever. For it to be a true chiasm, it must include the entire literary unit. So it's hard for us to understand the literary unit boundaries in the Bible because we think everything's on chapters and verses. You know, like, well, there's not a chiasm in chapter 24. Well, a French publisher on horseback decided that was a chapter. It's not a very careful, thought out break on the literary units. So one way that I find it helpful if you want to read this and find this is to find, if you go on BibleGateway.com, you can pick your translation of the Bible, and then you can tell the settings to turn off the verse and chapters. And it makes it much easier to find. The other one would be to pick up a Message Bible that is unnumbered. And they make Message Bibles where there is no numbering on the verses, so you can just read it as text. And there's something that just makes it a little bit easier to not have those numbers. And then if you feel that you've read something similar before, start looking above and below. If it is a chiasm, the argument center will be that key point. That key point may not matter to you. The key point might be, watch out for the Benjaminites. They're shady. That's the key point of a chiasm in the Bible. You don't care. You don't care. But that's a really good coded message to the tribes people, right? Watch out for the Benjaminites. They're shady. Okay, so you've got those north and south stories included, probably shuffled later to make the arguments more perfect, more chiastic. Oh my gosh. That's it. I did. I talked fast. I've had caffeine, and I'm excited about the chiastic structure. So let me see if
Is that structure that always drives me batty when I'm trying to read Proverbs? Because there's a lot of repeat.
It's a more narrative structure.
Okay.
There's a really awful chiasm that I will point you to. This is the one about the Benjaminites. It's something I don't preach ever, because it would be my last Sunday as a pastor. It's in Judges 19, is the last story. So let me see if I can find it. Okay, here are the names of the YouTube videos. Why is Judges 19 so messed up? All in caps. Okay. So there's a story about a sexual assault. And then there's a story about something else. And they end up talking about the Benjaminites in Judges 19. And then there's a story that is a lot like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that we're going to go through next week, because that's what we're going to do on video is Sodom and Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah bears some thinking and rethinking. So there's some send out the person inside the house stuff. And the man sends out his concubine, and she is abused through the night. And she crawls to this doorway, and he gets up and sees her, and he cuts her into pieces, and he sends her on away to the tribes to give them a message that something bad has happened. It is a horrible story. There's another story in the Chiast, right? So sometimes the stories aren't beautiful stories. Sometimes it's like, oh, and then a few pages later, oh, that's a Chiast. So that's outside our 5 books, but you see the Chiast outside the 5 books. And you may find from scholar to scholar, like if you read an Abingdon Bible commentary, I found this when I was doing the Gospels class, they'll be like, oh, Matthew has a chiastic structure here, here, and here. And then you open the Wesley commentary or the one by a different publisher, and it will have a different chiastic structure. So it's not like these are printed and only these are certified chias. Like people interpret them in different ways. But if you know that structure's in there, if you know it's a Supreme Court argument, you're going to get more points when you read it than if you try to read it as a 20th century argument. So if you go into like the Judges books, those are cyclical stories. I mean, it's a cycle over and over and over again, the narrative cycle of Judges, but you're going to find chiasts in there that are horrifying, and they're not tied to chapters and verses, right? It's a chunk of scripture that was worked on. Does that make sense? I don't imagine they all sat in a room with a MacBook and were like, okay, we're starting at word 1. You know, and typed it out and then, used Excel. It would be much easier now. Much easier now. They did it chunk by chunk. This story and this story. These stories go together. So you end up with these odd stories that we have in our homework that are... I am her brother. No, I am her husband. Okay, so let's look at the notebook if you have it, page 35. This is version 1. Any idea who wrote Genesis 12?
I call it Jay.
Ding, 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 ding. Okay, what happens in this? She was taken into Pharaoh's palace. And then, because Pharaoh thought he had been able to take into his palace Abram's sister, Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. One of the big questions is always, how did they get like a maidservant in their house? Where did they get wealth? Where did Abram and Sarah get wealth? These are the stories where they got their wealth, right? But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarah. So Pharaoh summoned Abram, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Take her and go. And he got to walk away with his wife and everything he had. This is a J story. There is no moralization. There is no, she was in the Pharaoh's harem. There's no making it right. There's no telling what year it was. So then we move on to version 2. And we are back Except we're not back, right? We're Abraham and Sarah. Do you notice their names are spelled differently in this story? Now, in Genesis, if you read it sequentially and not source by source, there's a moment where God changes their name to the name the other source uses. That's handy, right? So it's interesting that the names line up. And so he says, when they're in Gerar, he took her, right? He took Sarah, the king. Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream and said to him, "You are as good as dead. She's a married woman." Now, Abimelech had not gone near her. What source is this? It's got to be the E source, because we've had explaining away nothing bad, but nothing bad happened. It was all buttoned up. And you have the dream, right? And I don't know where Gerar is, but it's got to be I'm assuming it's north of Egypt. And so when they go through that, you get the story you even get the explanation for why Abraham did it. Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. Abraham doesn't even get to lie. He has to, it's like, I would rather be caught committing incest than lie about her being my wife, right? Because there's prohibitions, there's some weirdness there. But we're pre-law, so they would not be so weird about it as I'm being. But it's a choice. It's a choice he makes. And this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you, live wherever you like. And to Sarah, he said, I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so they could have children again. For the Lord.
Definitely not a P source there.
Right. This is not a P source. This is an E source.
Right.
It was certainly not that Abimelech was not with his wives during that week. Okay. So let's go so that is an E source. Reading K, she's my sister. Version 3. Now we are back with Abimelech. Now he's king of the Philistines in Gerar. It's a little early for the Philistines.
I was going to say, I put a question mark next
It's a little
to that.
early for the Philistines.
So are we still, never mind, keep going.
Oh, it's a little
You're
early.
gonna get there.
So he prohibits them from going down to Egypt, which is really interesting in Genesis. Because the next big chunk of Genesis, the last big chunk that I'm not really going to teach you, is the Joseph novella. Where do they go? They go down to Egypt, which is how they're there and get stuck in slavery for all those years. That's how the sweeping narrative goes. So he tells them not to go down to Egypt, but to go to where the Philistines are. And he's repeating his promise. This is Isaac of no personality. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, she's my sister, because he was afraid to say, she's my wife. He thought, the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebecca, because she is beautiful. It's boring, right? It's not as rich as any of the other stories. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife, Rebecca. She's really your wife. Why did you say she's my sister? Because I thought you'd kill me. Why have you done this to us? One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So they don't get any stuff. They don't walk away rich. in this one. They only take what they came with. It's very interesting.
And God's promised to take care of them while they're there.
Yeah, God's going to take care of them. And remember, I told you that I'm going to give this to your dad, and through your offspring. So it's a reiteration of the covenant, and maybe even a way to show the legitimacy of Isaac's claim. Like, see, Isaac did what his dad did. Isaac's Abraham Jr. He also went down there and did this. Or it could be that Jay heard the Esau's and then was like, that story's like ours, but it's different. And so we can have a different version. You can start imagining why these things might have popped up if you're not stuck on the idea that this literally happened and Abraham was there writing it down so he could give it to Moses later, generations later, right? Why is it there? What is it? Why is it there? What is it here to tell me? Why would this be important to God? Why would this show up in the word? Those are the things I try to think about as I'm doing it, as I'm reading scripture, because sometimes there's stuff that's just bizarre. Like the story today of David getting Saul's armor and the armor doesn't fit. Why do we have to stop and talk about that? Well, that's a good analogy. Because David and Saul are a literary foil. One of them is great, one of them is terrible, right? It's this dark and light. You see them in contrast to each other. And so that when he goes to put the armor on and the armor doesn't fit, I'm not even going to be the same kind of leader you are.
So if the shoe doesn't fit,
Right. And to go back to the legal thing, we could do if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Law tube. That's what I watch for fun. So, oh gosh, now I've lost completely my thread that I was talking about.
OJ has a habit to do with that.
No, we got to go from OJ to shoe not fitting. What were we talking about right before that? The armor, right? Thank you. So, why does that? Well, that ends up being really useful if we talk about the fact that when we face the unknown stuff, we want to put on all this armor. We don't even know what armor we need. So there are those details, I think, are there for a reason, and they add richness. They don't have to be one way, because in the Methodist Church, we're not a denomination that says, here is the official interpretation of David and Goliath. Here is the official interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So it's our job to teach you argument structures and things that you're going to encounter, because you get to have your own thoughts. It's not everybody's bag if they don't have the tools to do it. Then you come to a Bible study and you say something and Ken Thompson says, that's a nice idea. Mm-hmm. Ken, do you have any questions from the back of the room? No? It is a hard time, isn't it? Kind of a hard time in the afternoon. Stella would rather be sleeping.
So what would the ancient readers have thought of these three? Would they have seen them as three versions of the same story? Because I've grown up my whole life thinking that these were three separate stories, that they all happened, and that they just repeated their same patterns, like the Abraham and Sarah one. Like this happened in Egypt and then it happened in this other place.
And then his son turned around and did the same thing. It could be that, right? It could be that that's just part of the narrative cycle. Like we do this and then they do this and then they do this. It could be a little bit cyclical. And that may have been as they understood it. We don't know if men were really getting killed because their wives were pretty.
80 in their 80s at the time of the second story.
I know. Yeah. So it's unusual. We don't know how they would have perceived that. Would they have chuckled and been like, oh, this is telling me something? Or was that a reality they knew? Would they have known it hundreds of years later when they wrote it down? Was it something they understood hundreds of years later, but not when it happened? We don't always know. So when I teach when I have taught biblical scholarship from a Protestant perspective to a Jewish group of people or a group of people that includes Jewish people, I typically start with the book of Judith, which is in the Apocrypha, because the Apocrypha is very few people's sacred cows. It's the stories between the Testaments. And in the story of Judith, they talk all the time about Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria. He's Babylonian. None of the names are Assyrian. Like, they set it up with the wrong names so that you chuckle. Like, they're in on the joke that this is a story. And then the story of Judith ends up being, what does the name Judith mean? It means a female Jewish woman, like a Jewish woman. That's what it means. And so the story is a story meant to teach us what women do. I mean, this is the woman who said, you guys aren't going to defend this town that sits in front of Bethlehem, or in front of Jerusalem, whose name is Virginity. I will defend the town of Virginity for you. And she dresses herself up. She's been living in a tent on top of her house that her dead husband built for her when he was alive. And she's been in mourning, and all the townsmen, like the towns guys, are hitting on her. And she's like, you guys need to do something. And they go, thoughts and prayers, baby, thoughts and prayers. So she gets herself together and she prays, and she goes out to the enemy camp. She walks out, she goes there, she gets the guy's attention. She's carrying all of her food, and everybody says, why you got food? And she says, oh, because I'm Jewish, I have to eat kosher. And they all think she's just absolutely beautiful. And once the general decides he wants to try to seduce her, she works it until her food bag's empty, and then she waits till he's drunk and he passes out on her, and she picks up the sword over and she cuts off his head and she puts it in the food bag and she walks out. And everybody expects her to be carrying a bag. And she goes to the town and she walks back to the town of Virginity, and there she says, hey, look, guys. And she never got married for the rest of her life. The end. I mean, that's a really cheap version of the story, but that story helps people understand because it was written late enough that we're in on the joke. We can be in. Now, most people read it and be like, oh, the king of the Assyrians. No, you got to read the footnotes, and the footnotes will tell you there's something weird here. It's weird that every man who passes wolf whistles at her, and she's like a widow with grown children and she can't walk through the streets, right? I mean, she's got a tiara in her bag. It's very strange, but it's so strange and so late to be that strange that we get the strangeness, and then we can figure out we're missing cues, maybe to know, is this a story that got added to close the chaos, is to close the argument and the literary piece? We don't know necessarily what those chunks are. You can get them from that chart I gave you of like, this is J, this is P, this is E. That can help you. And you can actually use that chart to go through and read what we have of the J source. I think Charlotte did this the first time we had class. She read all the J source. She read all the P source. She had it. She read all the E source. And you can go through and read it and start to see maybe the chunks as they were. I'm not sure how oh, Stella loves Amanda. All right. Anything else?
What's with the Philistine plug during Isaac time anyway? Does anybody have ideas as to what's going on there?
Why they're talking about the Philistines? What'd you say?
To create a kingdom.
Create a kingdom.
It was the impetus.
Absolutely. I don't know. So, I mean, we usually talk about the Philistines like the late bronze, 1200s, 12th century. Seems a little weird. But if I'm in Marshfield, sorry, but my stomach's growling. into the microphone, probably. If I'm in Marshfield writing a story about something happened here in 1652, I might call the town Marshfield. It could be an anachronism. You know what I mean? Like, it may be, I'm telling you the story today, and this time they were down in Philistia, dealing with the people who live in Philistia, right?
Okay.
So it could be that.
There's that kind of stuff peppered throughout.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
The little, and like, let's use a word that we learned from the Persians, but the Persians don't exist yet. And those are clues. I mean, those were the kinds of things that I found threatening when I was in my previous denomination on the bus, the band trips, when all the mainline kids would pick on me for being whatever I was. And it was quite a relief to get to the point where those things interest me. They don't threaten my faith. Because how many times did I sit in Sunday school and say, but I don't understand why? And the teacher said, Kim, I'm going to tell your mom you asked that question. And once anyone asked about it before, I was like, tell her. It didn't go well. I mean, it went fine with my mom, but the teachers didn't want a kid with a smart mouth, little girl with a smart mouth asking those questions. And so I learned, you don't bring that up. You bring that up and they get mad. And how many of us quit asking questions because we thought that people around us might think we're heathens?
Or the fact that they didn't have that answer was scary.
Uh-huh. Right.
And like spitting out those scary questions.
Mhm.
Who's gonna answer me?
I've been literally told not to think about things so hard. Like, just don't think about it too hard. And it works. But probably I was trying to.
Just destroyed the next Nobel laureate.
I just destroyed the next Nobel laureate. Why?
Because you're not going to think hard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, not going to think hard. I think it's important to think about it and to let the scripture breathe. I think that's how we respect it. We respect the audience that it was written for, and we accept that it's not us. And it is a miracle and an act of God that God can still speak through us today. I mean, I've known all week I was going to preach David and Goliath. I did not know until yesterday, as I was writing it, what was really going to hit me in it. And it's like, man, after thousands of years, it's how many sermons have I preached about David and Goliath? How many times have I taught this? And I'm getting new stuff out of it today because I taught it in a scholarly way and let it breathe. So to me, that's that's a way to treat scripture with respect instead of making it conform. You will need this kind of form. No, let it be. All right. So that's our last in-person class. My stomach is growling quite rudely. I don't know if you've noticed. It's fun times. Is it coming through on the audio? No? Okay, good. Sorry, YouTube. All right, so we will put up a video this week. I will record it while I'm in St. Charles because I have really empty evenings because I'm antisocial when I'm around other pastors. I'm like, oh, other pastors getting together, and I'm gone. And I go back to my hotel room and I have lots of time. So I will just record the Bible study there. I'll be fine. Oh, I can't. I have to record a Bible study for my church. Don't ever look at our YouTube channel. The e-source would be like, but she did have to write.
She's truly spent all evening doing this.
Yes, and Jay would be like, oh, she just lied to them so she could go do what she wanted. And the P source would be like, on the evening of Thursday, June 5th, the Reverend Kim Polchow, daughter of Jay Polchow. When the moon was, I mean, you're getting, we're joking about it, but you're getting that it's distinctive voices. And it's like that Facebook thing, scrolling through Facebook and I see something and I go, Joy Shattuck would think that is so funny. Joy Shattuck posted that. It's that same kind of thing in the Bible. So you have the reference sheet. You will notice that by the end of the class, we're not going to talk about D because there's no D source in Genesis. Thanks be to God. Because the D source comes with the religious reforms of Josiah. And that's where we start to get the hard Old Testament or Hebrew scripture theology of you will be blessed if you do this, but cursed if you do that. And you start getting,
Deuteronomy source.
yes,
Yeah.
and you start getting, it's a little bit hard
Yeah, I watched your video series
on the D,
on
United
Yeah.
Monarchy.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we do have a series on the United Monarchy that's online on the YouTube channel that goes over that. If you're interested in the David stuff.
So how did they actually pull together like Genesis, for instance? I mean, they have all these different sources. And who did that? I mean, who finally said, we're gonna write this, we're gonna write that, we're gonna include this, we'll take that. And even though there's different versions of the same story,
Mm-hmm.
who did that and how did they put all that together and when?
So that's it's either exile, probably post-exile. So like restoration, we're back in,
Kind of pulling things together.
and they call the mysterious figure who did it the redactor.
Okay, so they think it was one person who pulled all this together, or?
Or a team. It's kind of like when they wrote the Gospels. When you read scholarly books about, say, the Gospel of John, one of the first things that puts people off is they talk about the Johannine community. The people who listened to John, who wrote the book of John, right? It wasn't a guy named John. I mean, there could have been a guy named John, but there was probably also a guy named Phil and a woman named Martha. You know, I mean, we don't know. But they do give a special name, and it's with a capital R, redactor. And they don't know how much the priests got done, but they think they had J and E, and then they wrote P. And then maybe when they came back and they were restoring things, they write this JAP. And then Josiah is doing the reforms. They're like fixing the temple. And all of a sudden a priest runs in and is like, I found a scroll we've never seen before that has a bunch of rules we'd forgotten. And we think that's the D source. And so they're important rules, but we don't have the same ethics and ideas of proof and proper citation and signing our letters and going on the record. They didn't do that stuff. It's no big deal to a Bible scholar to say, did Paul write this letter or did somebody pretend to be Paul? And sometimes people say, no, we know that's a thing.
Well, and to say pretend to be Paul is kind of extreme, because if I'm not mistaken, even after when his sight came back, it was still very poor. So it's not like it would have been easy for him to
write all these.
Write all these letters himself. Like technically, you could say that probably only a handful of the lines
Were in his
were
handwriting.
in his actual handwriting, right? That otherwise he was,
Scribe, if
Yeah.
it was even him.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my favorite Bible studies is, or daily devotionals is My Utmost for His Highest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written by Oswald Chambers, but he didn't actually put it together. His wife sat in his college classes and wrote down what he said and put the book together herself. So like it's his material, but he's not the one that actually wrote the book. But it is like legit what he said and what he taught. And like,
Was she his student?
I don't know. Or did she just audit his classes? I don't know.
There's ethical issues all over that. But it's super interesting. Yeah. Sometimes Chris will be doing something at work and we need to write an email and I'll say, I'll sit down and write it, Chris, but then I'll sign it, Chris, or Chris and Kim, or Chris can write it and I go, put my name on it. We're sitting there together. but she doesn't sign my name to legal documents, right? So we have different rules of what's ethical, what's unethical, what's how much we need to attach our names to it. Of course, Paul didn't sit down and say, like, today I'm going to write Holy Scripture. He said, I'm going to write to that stupid church in Capernaum. You know, like,
That's what it is.
I know, I'm a pastor, I know. We're like, I'm going to chew them, tell them what they're doing wrong. In the name of Jesus, please stop. So it's, thank you for coming in person to be in this. I know we're hearing from the folks on YouTube that they really like the format. So it helps me have energy to have people in the room. It's better than just talking to a camera.
Mm.
Well, thank you. It's been really good.
Well, thank you for being here. So next week we'll put up the Sodom and Gomorrah one, and you don't want to have the kids in the room when you watch it, right? Because yeah, there's.
I'm gonna force Audrey to sit through it with me. No, we're gonna go in right in.
Let me just say, it's a good thing we're not trying to monetize on YouTube.
I threw her in the pool. I'm just saying.
You just threw her in the pool? Oh my gosh.
It was only 4 foot deep.
How tall is she?
Well, she was only 4 years old.
Oh, okay. Are we done?
Hey, she learned how to swim quick.
Bye.
Something to do with WSI.